Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Danny. I'm a data scientist from Flashbots, and my colleagues. And it was super cool to hear the talk from last one because it lays a pretty good context about like DeFi trading and TradFi trading, and this is basically also my topic. I consolidated the title a little bit compared to the one listed in the conference, but pretty much we're going to talk about like the state of the market, reviews on data about DEX, MEV, and Orderflow. So the agenda here, a few bullet points is that I want to lay the context of like what does it look like for the DeFi space? How did it evolve in terms of like the DEX trading design and solutions over the years? And then as of today, who has the most of the like DEX order flow or like user adoption in the front end? And then we will look at the trend of the order flow markets privatization. And then we'll look at like a study that we did earlier this year with some other researchers to compare the execution quality across CowSwap, 1inch, and Uniswap X. And then we'll review some trends about like who are using the DEX trading for what reasons these days. And lastly, I want to highlight a study about the L2 MEV. And so this is basically like a diagram that I had for like how DeFi evolved from 2016. And basically in the very beginning, when Ethereum just came out, there was like naive order book DEX, where you have a taker and a maker, you have a relayer to match the orders, and if there's a match, then this order sends on chain. And initially, the order listing was also even on chain, which is highly gas inefficient, and the matching is also inefficient. And so later on, when Uniswap came out, they kind of solved the issue of liquidity by allowing anybody to just put a asset into the pool, and the pool define the price, which the earlier talk also highlighted about the curve. And AMM become popular, so many forks of Uniswap came out. And when there's more liquidity comes around, people realize, okay, now the liquidity is kind of fragmented again. And we kind of need to aggregate them to have the best price, because there could be a few like good price sitting across pool. And if I'm only using one pool, my price impact will be big, right? I would want to access the middle point of multiple pool. And so aggregators came out around 2020. 0x shifted from order book DEX become a aggregator together with like 1inch, and they're starting to like talk to professional market maker as well, who are saying, hey, like I can actually give you a better price than the AMM orders. So if you introduce our like inventory through this thing called RFQ, request for quote, I basically can provide you better price than what you can get for user from AMM. And so, you know, more and more institutions are interested into DeFi trading, providing liquidity. Now they're everywhere. Like Wintermute is one of the biggest. There's SCP, which is another MEV trading firm. They both providing liquidity as a market maker. They also like take arbitrages to like clear the stale liquidity from AMM. They also build blocks sometimes, and so they're deeper and deeper in the stack. And so then CowSwap came out, and they say, you know, if aggregation theory works, then why don't we just like aggregate on top of it? Like, and we also can outsource this like work to a set of people and introduce some auction and to make those people compete. And so instead of me having a routing algorithm designed to check across AMM and trying to aggregate them, why don't we just like let a bunch of people to compete to give us the best routing? And so that's like the solver DEX, I would call. Design came out. Together, 1inch Fusion, Uniswap X like launched it right after CowSwap starting to take adoption. One other thing I want to highlight though is MetaMask. So they are kind of also called a aggregator of aggregator or like meta aggregator, similar to CowSwap, but the way they are meta aggregating is really just like, you know, querying a bunch of like aggregator API. And they're just like comparing on top of like 3 fixed routing rather than having an actual auction. It's really interesting because the wallets, basically just seeing that user actually are not really price sensitive, right? And so they're basically saying, if we have the control of the user entry point, why don't we keep them inside of our app and charge them fee? And user actually use them still, and it was a pretty high fee. So 2025 is where we're at, and I think like the trend this year is more and more DEX are trying to integrate down the supply chain and trying to sell their order flow to this thing called OFA, order flow auction. So basically, when users' transactions are moving the liquidity in the pool, it's very likely it's causing a opportunity of arbitrage. And so if you expose this order information to a set of trusted searchers, they can likely submit a background on top of it, extract some value, return back to the application, maybe the user. So that's what the DEX with OFA idea is about. So map blocker and Flashbots map share is one of those. And we're also very excited about all the Uniswap v4 hooks that's coming up this year. So a quick quiz here in the room. Who do you think have the most retail adoption today for all the DEX front end? Yes. Okay. Why? Okay, I thought you were gonna say because they move when you make a trade. Okay, cool. Yeah, but to clarify, the retail adoption is measured by a deduped version of like how much volume were requested from front end. It's not, like directly just querying on like liquidity pool volume. And also, yeah, like it doesn't include any MEV bots that are, using the routers or like liquidity. So the answer for me is yes, it's CowSwap. I want to caveat the data here though is that we're undercounting 1inch fusion, but per my check as well, like including the 1inch fusion, CowSwap is still bigger than 1inch overall. We have this website called Orderflow.art trying to show like the landscape of like how different layers are, integrating with each one. Yeah, feel free to check it later. This data, the words is too small to read. But one interesting structure I want to highlight, which we mentioned just earlier, is that the OFA integration are getting bigger and bigger. So when you see like the solvers are getting the order, and later on they're not sending to public mempool, they're sending to some private services. For example, like map blocker here. There's many other OFA actually, to actually send the user transaction privately rather than in mempool and then to block builders. Sometimes they directly work with block builders. And so if we measure that trend over time, you could see that like in a 2.5-year horizon, the number of transactions in private mempool on Ethereum has been growing and growing, and up to date is around like 40% of number of transactions are in a private mempool, like meaning you see it on chain, but it was never seen in public by any like the nodes. So if you measure that, break it down, we can kind of see like, different OFA are taking some market share, pretty small. I think like larger, fraction here are like sent towards block builders because they want to also, get this exclusive order flow to get an edge in their block building competition. One other way to look at that number, which looks way more prominent, is that if you look at the subset of the most valuable order flow, which is the retail DEX trades, look at the volume, there's 70% today, and like there's like very obvious growth around last year, who are basically, all these like people down the supply chain are talking to all these front end to get their flow. So today, yeah, it's around 70% of all the transactions volume on DEX are going through private mempool as well. One last thing is something I shared like last week, where if you look at the priority gas fee people are paying across all these transactions, we kind of call them all as like MEV value. You would see like the mempool are dry already, basically. Like the mempool has less than 20% of, less than actually 12% of the MEV value are floating around. All the valuable transactions are already getting, privatized or commoditized by people. So yeah, so that was one of the trends I want to highlight. But next, I want to share an execution quality study, which I did it with a few researchers earlier. I feel the pressure because I see that the Uniswap data scientist is in the room. But so one thing we see all the time is like teams are fighting against each other on Twitter, and like CowSwap was constantly saying we have a better execution. And then the Uniswap data scientists will be like, that's not true because this and that. And so they're like fighting. And we wanted really to set like the conclusion of which one is executing better. And one other reason we want to do this is like, users still today don't realize that like the quoted price in the front end is not what you're getting in execution actually. So the price you see here is not going to be what the amount of USDC will land in your wallet. Because using this mental model from Xerox blog post a few years ago, there's a whole like process happens when you access the liquidity. There's LP fee you have to pay to the pool. There's price impact because how big the trade size you are making. And as the trade size goes bigger, your price impact goes bigger. But then also another layer of thing is like basically when you send the transaction in the mempool, it's possibly there is a simple collision of trades. Other people are trading the same thing at the same direction, paying a higher gas fee than you, will go get placed earlier than you and get the liquidity first, which means you're gonna have a slippage. Or the MEV searcher saw a transaction in mempool, and they are extracting some value out of it, and you're getting slippage. So that's why we really want to, also look into this data. One other thing to highlight is that even though all these like solver DEX has similar design of like a, like solver competition auction, they have very different market structure. So Uniswap X has two market makers making 90% volume. They're heavily, dominated by RFQ inventory. I would think like Uniswap X is pretty much one approach for the companies to try and introduce more and more, professional market makers inventory. And the 1inch Fusion has slightly less concentrated like portion, 3 market makers making 80% volume. And CosWeb is a lot more like decentralized, I guess, like have a lot more participants, and solvers are like making a 10% each other. The top round market maker is only making 25% of volume, and we know that's Wintermute, and I'm not joking. But what I also one silver lining is that, so there's this running joke, right? Like Wintermute is everywhere. They hold everyone's token. They dump everybody's token. So whenever like price goes down, they just tag their CEO on Twitter and be like, "What's going on? What are you doing?" And people blame every problem to Wintermute. But one silver lining is that on CowSwap, actually, this solver barter, they're now actually making more volume than Wintermute, like in the last 30 days. So we gotta believe in something. So it's not all just market maker and TradFi coming to DeFi all over again. But yeah, so I think like want to highlight a few fundamentals as well. Like when we look into the the data. One thing is that even though the market makers are like so powerful and like they have competitive pricing, they do have a preference to avoid risk, right? So like if you look at this charts that is breaking down the liquidity or volume that gets filled by different type of liquidity, you can see that like first of all, CowSwap and 1inch Fusion and Uniswap X has a very different distribution of like what type of liquidity are on their platform winning the orders. More particularly, this one is showing like for long tail tokens, almost all the platforms like combined together are filled by AMM. And for going down to the chart to the right, for ETH BTC major pair, they're actually getting more and more filled by market makers. Market makers would not want to hold like a super random meme coins which can go to zero in the next second, right? So they would not likely to fill that as a solver or a market maker. So we basically took like 6 months data. We compared it with a very naive routing of a single pool, which I think is a limitation of the study, and to compare with the executed trades to see like how does the benchmark number compare against the Uniswap V2 and V3 pool look like for the solver DEX. So like does the solver DEX actually improve pricing compared to a naive routing in AMM? And we basically see that we compared 2 pairs as well. For the major token pair USDC pair, we saw that actually like all of them compared to V2 had a pretty much good like positive improvement, which is a blue bar. And then the orange bar is like Uniswap, compare against the Uniswap V3, which is actually way more deep in terms of liquidity and like concentrated, harder to compete for solver DEX as well. This data might be a little bit like misleading. If you look at it just here, you just say, oh, CosWeb is better than 1inch and better than Uniswap X. But you really need to like control the distribution of the trade sides and look at the trend over time, right? Overall, the trade sides distribution. So you do see that like a lot of the negative points here for V2, V3 benchmark and the Binance mark order are all around like super small trade. That's likely like very noisy because of all kinds of like gas estimation that we're doing in the study, which is another limitation I want to highlight. But you do see it across the trend of bigger trade sides, the blue line goes up for all of the projects. So there's definitely a significant improvement of price execution when the trade size goes bigger if you're using a solver DEX compared to if you're using an old classic router on Uniswap. And it's much less obvious if you look at the orange dots, which is a comparison against the V3, which is way harder to like compete and improve. Another pair we looked at is Pepe, which is a representative of long tail assets, but it's also like big enough to have enough data sample. The results look super different because it's way harder to compete against V2, but it's way easier to compete against the V3. It all comes down to like the liquidity depth, right? Like, so for Pepe, most of the liquidity are actually in V2 pool, and that's where they're actually, you know, a lot better in terms of pricing. And while USDC has most of the liquidity in V3. So yeah, the conclusion is basically like, you know, it highly depending on the asset's liquidity condition, and the execution performance can vary largely against the different benchmarks. And overall, all solver DEX can improve the pricing better than a naive routing. I mean, I personally think like this study can be like improved way better if you can simulate a very complex routing, or like you can simulate the 0x aggregator, 1-inch aggregator, and so to actually say it's not just the better than naive routing, but actually even better than modern aggregators. So I'm looking forward to other people to work on this as well. And then as trade size grows, the performance actually become more and more prominent. So yeah, so the next part I want to share is that, do I still have time? Okay, cool. What are the new use cases growing on DEX? So when we aggregate the data we have and look at different front ends, a year ago when I was looking at this chart, people were like, not like panicking, but I was like, oh, okay, the new alpha is Telegram bots are taking volume. But that was the very small part, pink hat on the top. And it kind of dies down really quickly, especially on this like Ethereum data set. So like, did they really take on? Not really in terms of like the scale of the volume, because a lot of the Telegram bots are long tail, small trades, and I think like most of the people who are educated enough about like self-custody and wouldn't really put like more than $100 in Telegram bots where they hold your private key. But I wouldn't say like Telegram bots is not the trend, or like, you know, just not happening anymore, like because that was mostly on Ethereum. Ethereum here is like a super small like blue portion on top of the chart. The purple is all Solana. So like this activity and meme trading is definitely still happening, and mostly on Solana. And we do see that there was like a giant spike early this year because of the Trump coin, Libra coin, but now it's kind of dead, kind of like dying down. But even this number still is making somewhere around like 100 million annual revenue projection for like just one Telegram bot, who are the top one, the Trojan bot. Yeah, so it's still pretty crazy profitable business for the bots. Another trend I'm seeing is that like there's more and more use cases, or like adoption for cross-chain bridging and swapping. All these like bridge protocols are, you know, like having a pretty decent amount of like volume. That one chart is the I think layer 0 chart. It's just kind of sad because there's like an airdrop snapshot, and right after the volume just like went gone. So I think like we kind of need to question the number here. Is like how much are organic, how much are farming. Somebody correct me on Twitter though, like saying that number might be undercounting their like new version of protocol. I did check as well, but the shape looks similar. So, but yeah, it's very exciting to see if all these things gonna take off. When I zoom into this data though, like when I say look at 1-inch cross-chain swaps particularly, you then realize, okay, cross-chain swaps still is kind of just cross-chain bridging, because you see the token they're swapping is just USDC from one chain to another chain. So yeah, I think like it's more accurate to call them really like bridging rather than swap as of now. Yeah, so one last thing I want to mention is that we're also looking into like if there's MEV happening on L2, and if Flashbots needs to do something, and if we can provide any solutions for those problems. And you would think, right, like there were a lot of studies and showing that like when you have a faster blockchain, there will be less MEV, which I think is proven to be true theoretically. There was this paper that's showing that like your LVR amount is proportional to the square root of your block time. And sure, okay, MEV in terms of arbitrage opportunity will probably follow that rule, but there is another problem, which is spamming. So what we have seen recently, we published a study highlighting some data on Base particularly, is that spamming is becoming the problem as a bottleneck for L2 scaling. So if you look at this chart, it's showing that the gas throughput Base is scaling up, has become around like 35 million gas per second. But is that true? So if you look at actually what are the transactions on Base, then you realize a lot of the MEV bots, because the gas is so cheap, they are doing literally on-chain searching. So they're basically checking using on-chain math, using the gas, checking if this pool and that pool has a price difference. If I can extract a arbitrage with a profit, if yes, execute. If not, keep checking multiple pool, 100 pool. If there's no arbitrage, finish the transaction. And these transactions like does nothing in the end. It was just reading the state of the contracts, and they're just causing like millions of gas. And when they're also really good at hiding it. Like when you look at a transaction, it doesn't revert, so you wouldn't think it's an MEV bot, but it looks like transfer. But if you actually simulate the traces, you realize they're doing a lot of like searching on chain. And if we identify those transactions as spam and categorize how much gas were spent by them versus not, this is what it looks like. So half of the gas that Base is scaling are used by spam bots. And so like, are you really onboarding 1 million users, 10 million users? I think this is a good question to highlight for them. So we kind of like basically convert this chart to be a chart called effective gas throughput, which comes down to 20 million gas only when it's saying it's 35. So yeah, and it's not a problem just for Base. It's a problem for all the like, prominent high throughput L2s. So that's what we're seeing for those. And this was a GIF, but you can see that for one block, this is how the spam transactions are just, comes in as a red around like later position of the block, paying lower gas as well. So yeah, that's a blog post we posted recently. Highly recommend to give a read. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I want to talk about. If you're looking for a job or looking for people who are interested in the space. All right, thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.